CCS Institute, but could you wait for a moment, please?
Hi.
Then, from Global CCS Institute, the CEO, we have Mr. Jared Daniels, who will be introducing to us of the newly published in October 17th, the Global Status of CCS 2022. So please.
Well, thank you very much, Hiroshi, and thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation of how we can all work together to advance and accelerate CCS deployment. I'm very excited to join the Institute about a year ago, coming from the U.S. Department of Energy, and my main job now is to find ways where we can most efficiently work together to advance CCS. We heard already from Seki-san and from other colleagues the leadership here in Japan, the roadmap to accelerate and deploy CCS here. We heard from our colleague from NIDO, from the IEA analysis, the critical role that CCS needs to play. And so I'd like to take just several moments to step back and say, what is the status of CCS and the trajectory globally? We just heard from our colleague from Maria in terms of what's going on regionally. And from my perspective, harnessing all of that momentum and all of that forward progress and working together, that is what the CCS Institute is all about. And we look forward to that part of the conversation. I will try to be brief and again give that high-level overview to you today to help support our conversation later in the program. So on the next slide, again, we, as Hiroshi said, we recently reached our global status report. On the next slide, we can see that at high level, I think it's important that we always frame the appropriate role of CCS alongside all the other forms of low carbon and carbon mitigation approaches. And so from my perspective and from a chemical engineering perspective, in addition to driving in as much efficiency society-wide as we can achieve, in addition to driving in and deploying as much wind and solar and nuclear in the stationary power sector, all of the climate math suggests we still need a healthy amount of CCS to meet our climate change mitigation goals to get to sustainability to 1.5 degree scenarios. On the slide, you see at high level, how I like to frame the appropriate role of CCS alongside all of these other options to help us achieve deep decarbonization in hard to abate industries like steel and cement, the built environment where we live, industries like fertilizer to help feed the 8 billion people of the world and growing, right? These are roles for CCS where no other low carbon technology solution currently exists, right? How can we enable the production of low carbon hydrogen at scale? We can begin to build out that infrastructure now with hydrocarbon produced hydrogen integrated with carbon capture and storage. As we just heard, and we saw 42% expected of power in the developing Asian region by 2050 looks to be still for hydrocarbons, right? Providing that resiliency, that reliability, that economic operability of our stationary power system to decarbonize that. That is an appropriate role of CCS. And finally, delivering the net negative emissions, right? All the climate math says we are woefully behind. Time is not on our side. We are going to need to effectively pull CO2 from the atmosphere to achieve sustainability, to reach the 1.5 degree targets. That requires us to capture effectively carbon dioxide to transport and store it responsibly and at scale. Again, another critical role for CCS. And so I think it's important to frame the appropriate role and responsibility for us to collaborate to work together to deploy CCS at the beginning of any conversation regarding the technology. So on the next slide, again, at high level, we see globally many demand drivers. CCS is being driven by net zero commitments from governments and from private industry. Over 10,000 private companies have net zero commitments. Technically, they can't get there in many cases without CCS. The need for low carbon footprint commodities, cement and steel, another driver we see globally. And finally, the economic drivers of how do we balance economic growth and prosperity and a just transition with environmental performance and carbon management, again, a critical driver we see globally. On the next slide, I've got several graphics here to just basically show you the global perspective and trajectory. The number of projects announced and in development continues to grow. This is the 5th year that we have seen an expansion. The capacity of CCS projects, when we did the report, 244 million ton per annum. That's well over 260 million ton per annum now. You know, a 44, almost a 50% increase year on year. We expect that trend to continue. We see strong policy support for CCS, the appropriate role of CCS, predominantly in North America and Europe. We see strong action and motion supporting CCS projects here in the Asia-Pacific region and other regions of the world. But despite all of this project and momentum, let us not forget that where we are today, right, 30 projects, 40 million ton per annum, is a long way from where we need to go. If we look at the IEA analysis that our colleague from NIDO presented earlier, CCS needs to achieve gigaton scale removal per annum to help meet our collective challenge and goals, right? And so we have a long way to go to work together to make that successful. On the next slide, here's the growth we see. The red bar at the bottom are the current plants in operation globally, 30 commercial facilities capturing cumulatively on the order of 40 million metric ton per annum. And you can see this exponential curve in terms of projects in various stages of development. We expect that to continue. If we're to be successful reaching gigatons, that trend must continue for us to be successful. There's on the order of 200 facilities worldwide now in various forms of operation or development. On the next slide, you can see graphically where they are. In North America, where I live, much installed infrastructure, much good progress that's been done there. So a large majority of the operating projects in the world today are in the North American construct. You can see some dots in Europe. You can see some operating facilities in the Middle East and in China, Australia. If we go to the next slide, these are where all the projects are in development. We added over 60 new projects in this last year in terms of development, and you can see the regions for activity. Much activity supported by strong policy in North America, both in the United States and Canada, much interest and activity around the North Sea in Europe, good action in the Middle East and in China and in Australia and in Asia. Again, global development. This is wonderful momentum to see. On the next slide, you know, the status has been significant. We added 4 new facilities in operation. This included the first direct air capture with CCS project, the Orca project in Iceland, the first megaton, million ton per annum project in China that my colleague, Dr. Yang Xiaoliang, will mention next. And, you know, good progress operating in Canada and the United States, a capture on an ethanol plant in the United States, capture from gas-fired combustion in Canada. So again, much progress, good solid progress for policy development in the United States and Denmark and Canada, and many new countries coming to the mix. There's projects in over 20 countries around the world now, but countries where you didn't hear about CCS, though they are now getting in the game and joining the action to advance CCS. Finland and France, and Timor-Leste, Germany, right? It's exciting to see this project, many countries around the world. On the next slide, we see the evolution of storage moving to larger projects and also projects focused on geologic storage for the sake of climate change mitigation. Of the 30 projects currently, many of those are in North America. Many were driven commercially by enhanced oil recovery. Of the current operating projects, 21 out of the 30 are associated with enhanced recovery. Going forward, in many of the projects in development, we expect these projects to be focused on geologic storage for the sake of climate change mitigation. This is consistent with the climate math, and it's consistent with policy tools and business models that are supporting and appropriately valuing the removal of CO2, the storage of CO2 in the geosphere. We expect those trends to continue globally. On the next slide, we also see much focus on infrastructure development. We heard about shipping and the leadership here in Japan in terms of shipping CO2 to Tomakomai. There is interest and activity shipping CO2 in the North Sea as well. The Longship project, driven by our colleagues in Norway, are building dedicated 7,500 cubic meter CO2 carrying ships. Those are under construction now. We expect that trend, shipping CO2, to continue both in the Asia-Pacific region and in other regions around the world. We see storage licensing rounds, storing, giving you the legal opportunity to store large volumes of CO2 in the subsurface. That is progressing in a number of sovereign nations, Australia, Canada, Denmark, the UK. That is very supportive, accelerating deployment commercially of CCS. And I think many of you, certainly here in Japan, are familiar with the hydrogen energy supply chain and the work collaboratively that Australia and Japan are doing. World-class, world-leading work in terms of supporting the development and deployment of hydrogen as part of society's efforts to decarbonize and get us to where we want to be mid-century. So on the next slide, those are some of the trends we see. We've also noticed that the conversation around carbon dioxide removal, direct air capture, has grown tremendously in the last year. Again, consistent with the climate math that says we absolutely must deploy this at gigaton scale to help meet our challenging global goals. I was talking earlier with colleagues in the room from carbon engineering. It's wonderful to see the progress in this space. We at the Institute have done analysis that has shown if you can bring down the cost of direct air capture from where it currently is today to the mid $200 US per ton realm, that can reduce the total cost of climate change mitigation globally by over $1 trillion US. This is an extremely important technology. It is an integral part of the overall carbon capture and storage development and deployment that we must see if we're to be successful globally. And this is very active space, supported by social interests, supported by strong policy support in a number of regions and geographies. We expect this trend to continue going forward globally as well. On the next slide, from my view, we all need to find ways to work together. Government must drive roadmaps, supporting policies, put CCS in the appropriate position alongside all the other tools that we have. Industry needs to build, own, and operate CCS facilities at scale if we're going to reach that gigatons of deployment. The financial sector needs to lean forward. We, the CCS community, need to work with the financial sector for them to better understand the value proposition of CCS and how it must fit, how it can fit into their portfolio of sustainable development technologies and projects. And so there's much activity, there's much more that's required, but it's been nice to see an exponential growth in the CCS conversation in the finance sector as well. In carbon markets, how is the durable geologic long-term storage of CO2 valued, right, at a premium compared to some of the other carbon offsets that are trading in voluntary markets? And then how is CCS treated in ESG conversations? That is very important. The Institute under my leadership is leaning forward, trying to do good work in this area. But again, we've seen healthy growth in this conversation this past year as well. We expect and we'll do our part to continue that trend moving forward. On the next slide, I want to just very highly give you a broad overview of CCS development globally. And again, my two colleagues will follow up with detailed information in terms of in the Middle East and in China in specific. But at high level, again, much strong support and development. In the United States, the new law, the Inflation Reduction Act, is a game changer for all forms of low carbon deployment in the United States, full stop. With specific focus on the CCS attributes, it significantly enhances the 45Q tax policy tools, right? The figure of merit, the dollar per ton of CO2 capture goes up to $85 per ton for point source capture, $180 per ton to support direct air capture, right? Much of the analysis, whether it's from academics such as Princeton University, whether it's from financial institutions such as Credit Suisse, suggests that this new law in the United States alone will put more than 100 million ton per annum of CCS projects into a financeable category now. You can now get get commercial financing for CCS for, it's expected, well over 100 million metric ton per annum. That's 2.5 times global capacity. This is a huge step forward in the United States. We're already seeing projects being announced, being developed. We expect wonderful deployment going forward. But again, we could see in my country alone well over 100 million ton per annum additional yet this decade deployed before 2030. Similar good policy support in our neighbors from the north in Canada, and we expect to see large deployment opportunity in CCS there yet this decade as well. On the next slide, in Europe, we've seen more than a doubling of projects that are being progressed in Europe. Strong support from the European Commission and the EU overall, and in key countries such as Denmark and the UK and the Netherlands, strong support. I'll point out that in Denmark, several years ago, the Danish population was sort of agnostic, skeptical of CCS. In the last several years, they've understood that in order to decarbonize all of their society, the industry that supports their economy, they absolutely need CCS to be part of that overall strategy. And so now, strong support for Denmark, over 5 billion euro of support for CCS projects, and that societal shift occurred in only the last several years. Very rapid pace of change, again, consistent with the climate math of how we must all work together to accelerate deployment. Strong leadership in the European context by our colleagues in the UK as well. They prefer a hubs and clusters approach, a network approach, and they have strong policies to support CCS deployment in the UK. On the next slide, you'll hear from my colleague, Dr. Mohammed Abu Zahra here, but again, currently 3 out of the 30 facilities globally are operating in the Middle East, including the world's only commercial scale deployment of CCS on a steel facility in Al Rayada. And Mohammed will describe the exponential growth and deployment that we expect in his region as soon as I am done talking. In the next slide, we've already heard leadership from Japan and what we're doing at a regional basis, the Asian CCUS network and AREA's role there. My colleague, Dr. Xiaoliang Yang, will give you a more in-depth overview of the accelerated progress and support by government, by state-owned enterprises, by private industry in China. It is exciting to see the activity over the last year in China, and I expect strong growth across this region as well. The Institute is based in Australia. There is much strong support in some of at the subnational level in Australia. We are working to see how the new government in Australia will support CCS as part of their overall decarbonization strategy. But again, in the Asia-Pacific region, as all of you know, much activity in the CCS space. On the next slide, again, in order for this to work, this has to be driven by policy, right? By climate change mitigation policy. And it's nice to see over the last year that CCS is being appropriately recognized in the high-level policy documents that are driving the global dialogue. The publication of the International Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3 report that has CCS in the same sentence as wind and solar technologies, as technologies that must find deployment at those gigaton scales if we're all to be successful in meeting our climate change challenge. Over 20 countries now include CCS in their nationally determined contributions. We expect more to continue there. The next COP will be in the Middle East region, and so we expect CCS to be a larger part of that conversation going forward. To do our advocacy role from the Institute, Xiaoliang, Mohammed, and myself, 3 of our other colleagues were in Egypt several weeks ago in this year's COP, and it was nice to see that accelerated discussion around CCS, the need for CCS, the need for government, industry, finance sector to all work together to deploy CCS. That is starting to be part of those broader conversations. That is a positive thing to see as well. And again, as we just heard in terms of regional collaboration, here, the AREA, the Asian CCUS network, the leadership of Japan, we need to continue that as part of the discussion. How can we have that regional collaboration that can help us be successful getting deployment at scale on a global basis? On the next slide, again, at high level and in summary, realizing CCS at scale globally requires all of us to work together. We need to ensure that governments and leaders of industry clearly define the role of CCS and carbon dioxide removal as part of their national climate strategies, and then effectively communicate that to all aspects of society so we can have the support that's required, that social license to operate in order to get commercial scale deployment. We need to create a long-term high value on the durable long-term geologic scale storage of CO2. Absolutely critical to get this done commercially. We need to support and identify and appraise geologic storage resources. That takes time. We need to do that now. We need to work together to do that, especially in the developing regions of the world. Time is not on our side. We need to work together to work on these critical path issues that will allow us to achieve large-scale deployment. Many countries still need to develop specific CCS laws and regulations. We can collaborate and share lessons learned to do that well and efficiently. To find the opportunities for CCS networks, hubs and clusters, that is going to continue. That business model clearly can help us scale and accelerate our progress. Tremendous work and leadership here in the Asia Pacific region, and the Institute is doing much analysis in terms of what can we do to help facilitate these opportunities for networks. The Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, OGCI, they have been doing leading work in this area, but again, we all need to work together around this topic. And finally, as leaders in the CCS community, whether it's the IEA, the OGCI, the Institute, the Asian CCS network, we all need to have that conversation with the financial sector to get this to accelerate commercially. So on the next slide, I just want to leave you with the message that, again, all of the math says we must get from where we are to gigaton scale. That is well over a 100-fold increase from where we are today to where we need to be by 2050. From my view, and based on my 30 years of experience, this is achievable if we all work together. Governments have a role, industry has a role, organizations like the Institute have a role, but we all need to find a way to work together to accelerate the deployment, again, consistent with the math that says this is an absolute critical part of our overall climate change mitigation approach. And so for that, again, I thank you very much for your time and attention, for being part of this conversation. I look forward to the next two conversations and presentations from my colleagues in terms of in the Middle East region and in China. And I very much look forward to our panel discussion where we can have some good conversation, some Q&A about how we can work to achieve our goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, Gerard. Maybe we'd like to have some question and comment after the presentation by Xiaoliang and Mohammed, okay? ですね、それではこの後ですね、2つ、中東と中国に関するプレゼンテーションを
We have two presentations from MENA as well as China, and then at that juncture we'll entertain questions. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Mohammed Abu Zara, Head of Middle East North Africa region, MENA, of the Global CCS Institute. Dr. Mohammed, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn more and present more about the Middle East and North Africa. Our office in the Middle East is the most recent office for the Institute, and our operation there due to the high potential we see in growing CCS activities in that part of the world and the interest in that sense. So in this presentation, next slide, please. I'll be presenting more on what's happening in the MENA region and why CCS is essential for that part. Next slide. Yeah, so as a history, when we look at the Middle East, we know all the Middle East being the oil and gas hub. And I think it is essential for that part of the world to maintain their leadership in the energy sector and clean energy. And therefore, CCS, hydrogen, green hydrogen, or any colored hydrogen are essential in the future of that part of the world. If we look at the emissions, small nations, small emissions, however, if we look at the emissions per capita, most of the countries in the Gulf region, the Middle East, will become on top in the list when it comes to emissions per capita. A future for hydrogen is essential and important. Many countries has included CCS in their indices and commitment for reducing carbon emissions. There have been some major announcements in the region on future industrialization, where industry is still growing in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, and other countries. But to do that, we need to go hand in hand by reducing emissions, and CCS become an instrumental part of that. And overall, fossil fuels still a major source of energy, not only in the Middle East, but globally, and that's another driver for the need of CCS. So in the next slide, we talk about the current status of CCS. Jared mentioned that briefly. We have 3 large-scale operational facilities in the Middle East, one in Qatar, one in United Arab Emirates, which is the only one globally integrated with the steel industry, and the third one in Saudi Arabia from natural gas sweetening. The overall scale of these 3 projects is equivalent to 10% of the current carbon being captured globally. 4 countries in the region included CCS in their indices, and we see a major driver for power generation and blue hydrogen in the region, which also will bring CCS forward hand in hand with it. And again, all of these drivers encourage the Institute to move to the region and to have our office to open in Abu Dhabi. This year we hosted COP27 in Egypt, in that part of the world. COP28 is going to the UAE in November 2023, and having 2 COP conferences in the same geographical region has also pushed a major momentum for clean energy, including CCS, and we would expect to see more CCS-focused discussion in COP28 in UAE next year. Next slide. So what happened also over the last months and years, we have seen a major announcement during COP27 in Egypt, where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia announced the first CCUS hub in the region, Al Jubail Industrial Area Hub, where they want to reach a capacity of 9 million tons CO2 per year by 2027, and eventually to reach a total of 44 million tons per year by 2035. So that's a substantial scale, integrate multiple industries, and that's kind of like the business model we are pushing for, to see more clusters and hubs being established globally. Saudi Aramco published their sustainability report earlier this year in the summer, and they showed a clear commitment of 11 million tons annually of CO2 being captured. Qatar Gas just announced and signed the expansion of their North Field for LNG and the natural gas. And in that one, they showed a clear commitment of expanding the capture rate in these facilities to reach 5 million tons annually by 2025. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, they operate the current project with Emirates Steel, but also they have announced their plans for a second and a third phase to reach the capacity of 5 million tons annually by 2030. So we see some clear commitment, motivation, and these national oil companies in the different part of the Gulf region and MENA are moving forward with big announcement and commitment when it comes to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And it's important to mention that even the current projects are focusing on enhanced oil recovery. The one in Saudi Arabia and the commitment in the UAE are going to be more of a geological storage rather than enhanced oil recovery. Next slide, please. So there have been some good studies done also focusing on the region. Currently, we are working with OGCI and evaluating potential hub of CCUS in Egypt, and the study should be published very soon after we finish the final reviews. Also, one of our members in Egypt just signed an agreement with the EGAS, the Egypt Gas Holding Company, to evaluate the potential for CCS and carbon injection in the Nile Delta. Earlier also, Gaffney Klein and AFRI conducted a study for OGCI where they looked at the potential for CCUS hubs and CCS in general in the Gulf region. And if we look at the maps there, they have identified major potential for CO2 storage in that part of the world, and also they ranked around 11 different industrial locations that could be feasible as a CCUS hubs in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and the UAE in the Gulf region, but also at the Red Sea coast. Next slide. So if we look at the overall map, which Jared has shown, that square shows where the MENA region is. 3 operational projects in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Next slide, we can have like an idea or more details on these 3 projects. Al Riyadh project, which is in Abu Dhabi, the only project globally integrated with the steel industry, capacity of 800,000 tons CO2 per year. The CO2 is captured from the steel facilities, then transported with a pipeline into enhanced or recovery fields. Currently fully operational by ADNOC, but it was a special business model at the start where the push for this project came from a joint venture between Masdar Clean Energy and Abu Dhabi National Oil Company with the support of Emirates Steel. So this partnership pushed for this project to move forward with a successful business model. In the next slide is the projects in Saudi Arabia. There are 2 projects. One is Al Uthmaniyah project, a similar scale to the project in the UAE, run by Aramco for enhanced oil recovery. And there is a smaller scale project of around 500,000 ton run by SABIC, and that goes into CO2 utilization and conversion into fuel and other type of products, and part of that into a food grade CO2 is being produced. In the next slide is an overview of the project in Qatar, and that's the largest in the region, linked to LNG and natural gas sweetening, and I think should show 2.18, not 1.18, the capacity, just to correct that, sorry for the typo. And this project is the first phase in the North Field, and as I said, Qatar has announced the expansion of the North Field, and then this capacity will be increased to 5 to 7 million ton per year. Next slide. So I want just to, if you click again, there must be a couple of circles showing. If you look at this overall map, all the projects we have globally, I want just to highlight the ones in the Middle East to show the capacity building and how things has evolved. If you look at the yellow dot there, that one normally we don't show in our status report because it's not a fully integrated project. That's the Ain Salah project in Algeria. That project has been kind of a pilot for CO2 injection in a gas field. That has built knowledge capacity in our region on how to handle CO2 injection and to monitor the CO2 after being injected and the field has been sealed. Then more projects has been grown. The dot all the way top is the Abu Dhabi one, and it's the only one currently operational in the steel industry. And then we have the one in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and the other ones in the planning phase in the UAE, Qatar, and Al Jubail hub, which should appear also on our map in the coming period. Next slide. Yeah, so this is just like highlighting these projects. Next one, please. So where do we see the market if we talk about the Middle East? Next slide, just click. Yeah, so if you look at these circles, we talked about the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE is leading, and they have ongoing project plans for hubs and so on. Another important part in our region is the Mediterranean, where we have Egypt and Israel, and there have been major activities happening in both countries in evaluating the potential for CO2 geological storage and the potential for establishing an integrated gas hub, which could include CO2, hydrogen, benefiting from the available infrastructure in the Mediterranean Sea and that part of the world when it comes to LNG and natural gas. South Africa is another location. We have our member there. They have been actively looking for identifying sites for CO2 geological storage, and then aim for an integrated project together with Sasol. I've mentioned Algeria and the En Salah projects. There have been some discussions recently with the close proximity to Europe, how we can have like an integrated energy and a CO2 transport and business model between Europe and that part of the world. Next slide, please. Next slide, click. Yeah, so if we identify these countries, we look closely at the region. The high potential in the region is mainly Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. This is the countries are already moving. They have plans, they have their indices, and they have more of a pushed vision for CCUS. However, other countries like Oman, Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, Kazakhstan, and South Africa, they are doing some activities. For example, Oman, their oil is heavy, they need enhanced oil recovery. So a major push for Oman to be engaged is the enhanced oil recovery activities and projects. Bahrain is a small nation with limited storage capacity, and they have been working closely with Saudi Arabia to evaluate cross-border transport and some integrated projects with Saudi Arabia as well. Next slide. So what are the differences? I want just to highlight something important when we compare the Middle East region with other regions. We need to appreciate, I think, the differences globally when we look at Europe, North America, Asia, China, Middle East. And that's very essential if we want to conduct business in these parts of the world. For example, in the Middle East, it is known for being oil and gas, so we don't see that much public opposition to CCS being associated with the fossil fuel. So that's a major advantage for these big projects, could move with a good public acceptance and support. Also, there have been some attractiveness in terms of the low cost. Oil production in Saudi Arabia and UAE is known as being one of the lowest globally, and that might also be reflected on the CO2 injection for enhanced oil recovery and geological storage as well. Next slide. So where is the potential and what are the industries? Gas processing is an important industry in the region. The association with enhanced oil recovery will give some good business models. And then we have the industry CO2, which moved forward already. The steel industry, LNG, and others will follow. And as was said, the plan for the next phase of projects in the Middle East will focus on geological storage formation rather than enhanced oil recovery. Next slide. So I'll finish in 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah, so we have run some extended analysis on how the region look like, what type of industries that might evolve, and how the projection for the CO2 capacity will look like. So there will be a contribution from different industries. For example, ADNOC is evaluating projects in their own petrochemical operation and gas operation. And then eventually with the time, we'll see more of the gas power and other industries joining and installing some CO2 capacity. Next slide. Similarly for the countries, so Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar already started. They will continue to be in the lead with the second and third phase they are doing, but eventually Oman and Bahrain will come on board as well with some CCS project. Kuwait might come on a later stage due to the lower interest and potential in Kuwait. Next slide. Okay, I thought I removed these. So I will skip the last 4 slides. Simply, it's more of detailing our analysis on what type of entities and research organizations are being active in that part of the world. Of course, the leaders in the region are the national oil companies, like in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, or the holding companies in Egypt. They work closely with the international oil companies, but also other industries like Cement is a major source of emissions in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other parts. Steel and aluminum in Bahrain and the UAE is very essential. So these industries also are getting engaged. Regulators from the Ministries of Energy and Environment and Ministries of Petroleum are also engaged into the discussion. So to conclude and to try to stay on time, I think we have great momentum and we can see that. Good steps will be made and big announcements are expected to come up on board on the road to COP28 in the UAE. And as an institute with our members, we tried our best to be part of that discussion and to push for more CCS to be into the picture in the coming year. So I'll leave it here. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Mohammed.
Now we would like to proceed to the next presentation from China. We have the China Country Manager, Dr. Xiaoliang Yang, to provide us with the presentation on overview about the CCS in China. The floor is yours.
Good morning. So thank you very much for having me here. I still have like 10 minutes left, so I will try my best to give you a very good overview on what is happening in China regarding CCUS development. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So my entire presentation will be centered around 4 key messages. The first one is China cannot achieve carbon neutrality without CCUS. The second one is a great momentum has been happening in China, primarily driven by the SOEs since 2021. However, more policy work needs to be done so this momentum can be more sustainable. Finally, international engagement and collaboration are very much welcomed in China, but the COVID situation is making this very hard. Next slide, please. So before I get into CCUS specific content, I'd like to share some very high-level China's key climate target and progress. So you all know China's overall target for its climate issue is to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. So, however, they have 3 specific targets. The first one is to lower its carbon intensity by over 65% in 2030 from 2005 level. The current progress is 51% in 2021. The second one is to have its non-fossil fuels in its primary energy consumption to around 25% in 2030. Now the current progress is 17%. So when we talk about the non-fossil fuels in China, we not only talk about the wind, solar, we also talk about nuclear and hydro. Finally, so China is going to increase its installed capacity of wind and solar power to over 1,200 gigawatts by 2030. And last year, China has achieved 635 gigawatts. Next slide, please. So why CCUS is essential for China? If you look at these 2 figures, so China alone accounts for 30% of global fossil-related CO2 emissions in 2020, and among these emissions, 80% in China come from power generation and hard-to-abate industry processes. So that's why CCUS will be so critical for China to achieve the last mile of carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. So after 2020, there are so many studies trying to understand how much CO2 reduction will be needed from CCUS in the next 30 to 40 years. So here is the number I got from Act 21 of the Ministry of Science and Technology. So by 2050, 2 gigatons CO2 reductions will be required from CCUS in order for China to achieve its carbon neutrality. And among the 2 gigatons, 1 gigaton is from CoPower sector, because the CoPower sector is still very important for China's energy security. And 0.6 gigaton will come from hard-to-abate industry process, including cement, steel, chemical. And 0.4 will come from BACs and direct air capture, CCUS. Next slide, please. So these 2 figures basically show you where have the most potential for China to develop large-scale CCUS networks. The one on your left side shows you all the major emitters, and power plant, steel plant, coal-to-chemical plants, as well as the cement plant. On your right side, so Act 21 basically integrated the emitter information to the information provided by Chinese Geological Survey. So you could say Xinjiang Province, Jiangsu Basin, Ordos Basin, and Shongliao Basin and the Bohai Basin is close to East China Sea will be most promising area for China to develop CCUS hubs and networks. Next, please. So policy single in China is very clear. China is going to support integrated million-ton scale CCUS project or demonstrations between now and 2030. So you all know China has this 1+N climate policy framework for all climate-related policy issues. So the one document means working guidance for all sectors and all regions, which was released in October last year. And under this one document, there are documents for different regions and different sectors. So I basically highlighted the documents in blue that specifically incorporated CCUS in its policy language. I also selected 3 policy documents to share with you. For example, in the 14th five-year plan, there is specific language saying China is going to make a demonstration for a CCUS project between now and 2025, which China actually did. I will show you in my next slide. The second one is the key working priorities in China's carbon targets. It is said China will continue to conduct R&D of low-cost CCUS technologies and promote million-ton scale integrated CCUS demonstrations. The last one is China's Science and Technology Development Action Plan. And this is the first time China mentioned the CDR technology. Actually, I shared this with our carbon engineering colleague a couple of months ago. Next slide, please. I also would like to show you the only quantitative policy incentives we have in China for CCUS project, which was initiated by People's Bank of China in November 2021. Basically, PBOC provides low-cost loans to financial banks at the interest rate around 1.25. And these banks can give the money to the decarbonization project at the 4%. The interest rate, and actually the current market interest rates for this kind of project depends on your SOEs, state-owned or private companies. The interest rate is around between 6 to 8%. So actually this is quite good for a decarbonization project. And recently two foreign banks were being added in this scheme, and Deutsche Bank and Societe Generale. And the CCUS is one of the 3 categories People's Bank of China is supporting. One is the other 2 are energy saving and the renewable project. Next slide, please. So why I say there has been a momentum in China for CCUS. If you look at this timeline, in September, China's president made this announcement about the carbon neutrality. And after 10 months after, in July 2021, Sinopec announced China's first megaton scale integrated project. Just 1 month, in August 2021, Sinopec announced China's first offshore CO2 storage project. And in September last year, Hualeng announced China's first megaton scale CoPower CCS project. And this one is going to be the world's largest CoPower CCS project, a little bit larger than Petronova project in Texas. And in October last year, CCUS was incorporated into China's one document, which is the highest climate policy guidance. Next slide, please. So the momentum continues in 2022. At the end of June, Sinopec, Shell, ExxonMobil announced a joint study for I think a 10 million ton scale offshore CCUS hub in Guangdong province. And in July, China's first CCUS projects in steel sector began to construct. And just at the end of August, on August 25th, and China's first 1 million ton scale integrated CCUS project commenced full operation in Shandong province. In October, China's first CCUS, I think this is also the world's first CCUS project from glass furnace, started full operation. And finally, at the beginning of November, on November 4th, Sinopec, Baowu Steel, BASF, and Shell announced a feasibility study of developing a 10 million ton CCUS project in East China region. So next slide, please. So in summary, at this point, there are 90 CCUS-related projects in China at different scales with different stages. So 30 plus are carbon capture related, and 30 plus are carbon utilization related. So if you add the capture capacity together, the operational capture capacity is 4 million tons per year, and the operational injection capacity is like 2 million tons. So you see the 2 million ton gap. So for some research projects, they capture CO2, then release it to atmosphere. So next slide, please. So in my next few slides, I would like to provide you some specific project descriptions. But at first, I would like to show you the map. Where are the projects happening in China? So Sinopec, China's first million ton scale CCUS project, is in Shandong province. And Taizhou CoPower project is going to be 500 K ton CoPower CCUS project is in Jiangsu province. I think, so you know the location, right? Jiangsu province next to Shanghai city. And the Sinopec Baowu Shale Bus is developing 10 million ton scale CCUS hub in Yangtze River Delta, which is surrounding Shanghai city. And the Sinopec Shale ExxonMobil is developing the CCUS hub in Dayawan, offshore Dayawan Bay area in Guangdong province. And Sinopec, China's first offshore CO2 storage project, is like 200 kilometers away from Hong Kong. So down there. So Hualeng, China's first million ton scale CoPower CCUS project, will be developed in Ganshu, in Ordos Basin. And China's OG Cellulose West Hub is in Xinjiang province, in Jiangkou Basin. Next slide, please. So this one, Jinjiang CoPower CCUS project, is in Yulin City. I think some Japanese companies also have operation in this area. So this is developed by China National Energy, and now it's the largest operational CoPower CCUS project since July 2021. And I took this picture last July, and you can see the observer, regeneration tower, and these are two like CO2 tanks. So it's basically capture CO2 with amine-based chemical absorption approach. And at this point, the scale is 150 K ton per year. The released capture cost, including investment cost and operation cost, is $42 per ton. And the partial of CO2 sold to food companies, and some of the CO2 are used for enhanced oil recovery. Next slide, please. So after the Jinjiang project, China National Energy is going to develop, to scale up a little bit, so from 150K to 500K ton per year. And this project is in Jiangsu province, and the main construction is happening now. So actually, my friends took these two pictures at the beginning of November for me to prepare the slides. So the main construction will be completed by the end of this year, and it's also amine-based post-combustion chemical absorption approach. The design capture cost will be $33 per ton. So China National Energy would like to reduce the current cost, $42 to $33 per ton. Next slide, please. So this one is China's first 1 million ton scale integrated CCUS project. So basically, Sinopec capture CO2 from coal to syngas process in its Qilu petrochemical plant. And they transport the CO2 to Senli oil field, which is around 80 kilometers to 100 kilometers. So at this point, Sinopec purchased 46 trucks to deliver the CO2. However, at the same time, at the end of August, Sinopec started to develop China's first 100-kilometer supercritical CO2 pipeline, I think, which should be completed, the construction, by the end of this year. So next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So I think this is the final project I would like to share with you, because this is going to be China's first 1.5 million ton per annum CoPower CCUS project. And this project is different from the China National Energy one, because they are building this carbon capture facility together with this brand new CoPower generation. So this CoPower plant is 2 times 1,000 megawatt U2 supercooled CO2 CoPower generation plant. And they will capture CO2 from the unit 2. And so the construction should be starting right now in Gansu province, and the construction is expected to be completed by the end of 2023. So some of the CO2 will be used for CNPC's enhanced oil recovery, and some of the CO2 will be stored in a nearby geological site. And so they are also planning to use the pipeline for this integrated CCUS project. Design capture cost is $35 per ton. Next slide, please. In addition to these 4 big ones, I want to show you some smaller ones. The first one is China's first offshore CO2 storage project. Basically, CNOOC separates CO2 from natural gas production, which the project is under construction. It should be fully operational next year. And the China Building Materials Group has completed China's first CO2 capture project from glass flares. And Longqing, which is a private environmental company in China, they completed China's first waste-to-energy facility, CO2 capture facility. So this picture here is the waste-to-energy carbon capture facility. It's quite small, but it's still significant because this is the first one in China. And Baotou Steel is constructing China's first steel sector CCUS project in Inner Mongolia. So next slide, please. So this is my final slide. However, I talked about the momentum. I talked about all the projects. In order for China to continue this momentum, I think we still have a lot of work to do. First one, China needs to clearly define the role of CCUS in China's long-term climate strategy and in NDC, just like what they did for renewable energy targets or non-fossil energy targets. Second one, we hope China can develop more specific policy incentives to create a more sustainable CCUS model. So at this point, all the SOEs are using their own money from their own balance sheet to develop this CCUS project. However, I don't think this will be sustainable in the long term. The third one, I think a clear laws or regulatory framework will be required for China to develop CCUS project in a more environmentally sound manner. And finally, as I said, there is a low infrastructure for China now to develop 10 million ton or even larger CCUS hubs. So government needs to support the infrastructure. Finally, I think technology innovation is always important in China to drive CCUS cost down. So that's all from me. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Xiaoran. Okay, thank you. ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. We are already beyond the time we're supposed to break, and we have reduced your lunchtime, and I'm very sorry for that. Now, I'm sorry, but we would like to resume at 1 o'clock as scheduled. So there are only about 45 minutes for you for lunch. So if you could come back to this hall by 1 o'clock. And if you will be exiting this hall, if you could leave your simultaneous interpretation devices on your table.